The church fell into a stunned, suffocating silence as a black man in a plain black suit stepped through the doorway, clutching a delicate silver locket in his hand. Faces twisted in confusion, then horror. The kind of horror born not of grief, but of something far older, far uglier. Richard Reed, the proud patriarch, turned crimson with rage, while Darlene clutched her chest as if the very sight of the man had knocked the breath from her lungs. And when he spoke, calm, steady, unshakable, the truth he unleashed shattered everything they thought they knew about Isabel. But what happened next would leave the entire town gasping, and it would expose secrets they were never meant to face. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The hidden life. Isabel Reed had spent her life mastering the delicate art of appearances. In the sun-drenched streets of Fairview, Georgia, a place where Sunday service attendance was as expected as breathing, Isabel was seen as the embodiment of small-town virtue, respectful, ambitious, and above all, dutiful. From the outside, she seemed untouched by rebellion, a daughter who had been carefully molded to inherit not just the family name, but its values and its prejudices. But beneath the polished exterior, Isabel lived a life stitched together with lies she told not just to her family, but to herself. Lies she thought would protect everyone she loved. It began innocently enough. A philosophy class at Savannah State, a debate about justice, where a confident voice had caught her attention. Marcus Turner, tall, sharply intelligent, his laugh infectious enough to shatter her careful walls. What started as study sessions grew into late-night conversations about books, dreams, futures far beyond the borders of Fairview. Isabel had fallen in love before she even realized it, not just with Marcus, but with the person she became around him. And yet, with every deepening layer of intimacy, dread gnawed at the edges of her happiness. Each time Marcus suggested a weekend visit to meet her family, Isabel would construct another elaborate, smiling excuse. Her father's heart problems, her mother's delicate nerves, a cousin's impending wedding. She cloaked her terror in logistics, in timing, in careful half-truths. Because the real truth, the one she could never bear to say aloud, was uglier than any polite deflection could mask. Richard Reed, her father, a man who taught her to ride a bike and quizzed her on Civil War history as if it were family lore, still used racial slurs without a second thought. Darlene, her mother, whose casseroles had won blue ribbons at the county fair, spoke in hushed, clipped tones whenever a black family moved onto their street, whispering about the wrong kind of neighbors. Isabel had grown up breathing that poison, even when she told herself she was immune to it. When she looked into Marcus's eyes, she saw not just the man she loved, but the impossibility of bringing those two worlds together. So she carved her life into two uneven halves, the public daughter and the private woman. Thanksgiving dinners spent politely lying about work deadlines, Christmas mornings texting Marcus in secret while unwrapping presents from parents who would have recoiled from the very idea of him. Every year, she promised herself that next year would be different. Next year, she would find the courage. But fear calcified into habit, habit into permanence. And before she knew it, nearly 15 years had passed, leaving a growing, unbridgeable canyon between the life she showed the world and the love that quietly filled her heart. The deathbed summons. The years had a strange way of passing, quietly at first, then all at once. Isabel and Marcus built a hidden world together, tucked away from prying eyes. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. A 2-bedroom home on the quieter side of Savannah, worn hardwood floors that creaked under their late-night dances, photographs of sunlit beaches carefully kept out of sight from any visiting friends who might ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. They laughed. They traveled when they could. They grew careers that mattered to no one but themselves. And still, Isabel's family remained a ghostly weight in the background, an unfinished conversation that hardened into silence the longer it went unspoken. Her family, for their part, crafted their own story. Isabel, the ambitious daughter too busy conquering the corporate world to bother with marriage. It was easier that way. No uncomfortable questions, no messy truths. But fate, as it so often does, has little patience for fragile illusions. It started with fatigue, the kind that sleep never seemed to touch. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 4. Aggressive. Unforgiving. Marcus sat by her side in the sterile oncology ward as doctors threw words at them like palliative and months, maybe less. Isabel nodded, polite as ever, but her hands trembled where Marcus could feel them. Small betrayals her spirit couldn't hide. At first, she fought with the same stubbornness that had carried her through everything else. Experimental treatments, endless hospital stays. Marcus never left her side. He learned the sharp, sterile smell of chemotherapy wards. He learned how to steady a woman who had once been invincible when she collapsed against the bathroom sink. But the body has its limits, even when the heart refuses to surrender. As Isabel weakened, the carefully constructed walls she'd spent years maintaining began to crack. Guilt festered inside her, more painful than the tumors eating her from within. She had loved Marcus with everything she had, but she had hidden him like a shameful secret. The weight of that betrayal, unspoken but ever present, grew heavier with each labored breath. In the final days, when the world narrowed to the hum of machines and the ragged sound of breathing, Isabel reached for him with trembling fingers. Her voice, once so strong and sure, was a rasp against the sterile quiet of the hospital room. "Marcus," she whispered, her lips barely forming the words, "promise me, when I'm gone, you'll go to them, not to be accepted, not to make peace, but to show them what they chose to never see." Marcus swallowed his grief, feeling it claw at his throat. He pressed her hand to his lips, nodded through the tears he could no longer hold back, and said, "I promise." Isabel smiled, a small, fragile thing, and closed her eyes, the fight finally slipping from her body. When the call came summoning the Reed family to her funeral, they arrived wrapped in polite sorrow and silent self-congratulation, certain that they knew everything about the daughter they had raised. They didn't notice the man standing quietly at the back of the church, head bowed, fingers closed tightly around a delicate silver locket. A man who carried the truth they had spent a lifetime refusing to imagine. They didn't notice him yet, but they would. The explosion. For a moment after Marcus stepped into the church, the air itself seemed to clot with tension. Conversations choked mid-sentence. The soft rustle of hymnals and mourning clothes fell silent. Heads turned one by one, following an invisible thread of horror straight to the man standing near the entrance. The man no one recognized, yet everyone instantly understood didn't belong. Richard Reed's expression was the first to shift, his features twisting into something monstrous. A grotesque fusion of shock, disbelief, and fury. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first, only a low, strangled sound like a growl forced through clenched teeth. Beside him, Darlene Reed's knees wobbled visibly. She clutched the edge of the pew as though the very earth had lurched beneath her. Clint Reed, Isabel's brother, younger but carved from the same bitter stone, sneered with an arrogance that barely masked his confusion. The silence shattered. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Clint barked, his voice slicing through the sanctuary, thick with outrage. Marcus didn't flinch. He stood at the foot of the aisle, the stained glass behind him casting fractured light across his dark suit and the delicate locket in his palm. His voice was steady, almost unnaturally calm, the kind of calm that only comes from pain too deep for anger. "I'm Isabel's husband," he said, each word deliberate, unshakable. We were married 10 years ago. She loved you, but she couldn't bear your hate." The words cracked across the room like a gunshot. Whispers swelled, low at first, then rising. Hissing, muttering, the congregation's confusion fermenting into open uproar. Faces twisted with disbelief, pity, judgment. Richard lurched from the pew, his fists clenched, veins bulging at his temples. With a roar of wounded pride, he lunged at Marcus, trying to shove him back toward the doors. But Marcus stood firm, his shoes grating against the tiled floor, his body a wall against the tidal wave of rejection. "You don't belong here," Richard spat, his voice frothing with hatred. "You never deserved her." The pastor, an aging man with thinning white hair, stumbled forward, hands raised in a desperate, useless attempt to de-escalate. "Please, this is a house of God," he began, but the venom in the room had already poisoned the air beyond saving. Without speaking, Marcus slipped his hand into his pocket and drew out a folded piece of paper, worn, creased at the edges. Isabel's handwriting, familiar and unmistakable to anyone who had once known her. He unfolded it with reverence, smoothing it open with trembling fingers, and began to read aloud. The words cut deeper than any confrontation could. Isabel's voice, resurrected through the letter, peeled back years of silence and cowardice. She confessed to hiding Marcus not because she was ashamed of him, but because she had been ashamed of them. Of the legacy of hate she could never make peace with. She spoke of the nights she cried alone, the guilt she could never voice, the dream she carried to her grave, that maybe, in death, she could finally force them to see the wreckage they had made of her heart. As Marcus's voice echoed through the sanctuary, the room changed. Clint's sneer faltered, the sneer collapsing into something closer to shock, maybe even shame. Darlene sank onto the pew like a marionette whose strings had been cut, her trembling hands pressed to her lips. Richard stood frozen, his rage turned hollow, gutted by the words of the daughter he had never really known. No one dared move. No one dared speak. The only sound was Marcus's voice, steady and devastating, delivering the final truth that no one, not even now, could undo. The final blow and catharsis. The letter finished like a blade drawn slowly from a wound, leaving a silence so complete that even the old wooden beams of the church seemed to hold their breath. Isabel's words hung in the air, raw and undeniable, echoing in the space between grieving hymns and hypocritical mourning. There was no room left for denial, no refuge in polite lies. The truth, jagged, bleeding, had been set loose. Richard Reed was the first to break, his face, once crimson with rage, now blanched sickly pale. Without a word, without a backward glance, he turned sharply on his heel and stormed up the aisle, boots striking the stone floor like gunshots. Heads swiveled to watch him, the great patriarch of Fairview retreating, stripped of his armor of pride. Each step he took out of the church was an admission more devastating than any shouted defense. Darlene stayed rooted to the pew, her body trembling under the weight of everything she refused to face. Fat tears spilled from her eyes, carving paths through her carefully applied makeup. Her mouth opened as if to call out to Marcus, to Isabel, but no sound came. She clutched her lace handkerchief to her chest and wept quietly, the sobs of a woman realizing she had lived long enough to witness the collapse of her carefully built world. Yet still, she did not move toward him. Even in ruin, the distance remained. Clint, who had been the loudest, the angriest, the most eager to strike, sat frozen now. His fists, once balled in contempt, relaxed limply against his thighs. His eyes, wild with hatred just moments before, flickered with something unfamiliar, something dangerous in its vulnerability, shame. Slowly, as if dragged down by the unbearable weight of his own soul, Clint lowered his head into his hands. He said nothing. No apology, no plea. Only silence, heavy and thick. Marcus stood alone at the front of the church, the sun slanting through the stained glass and washing him in shards of color. He looked at them, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a heartbreaking stillness. There was no satisfaction in watching them crumble. There was only the simple, brutal clarity of the moment. They had lost Isabel long before they realized it. They had buried her love with their hatred. He did not need their forgiveness. He did not seek their approval. He had given Isabel what she asked, the truth, delivered without vengeance, without malice, but with unflinching honesty. He had shown them not what they wanted to believe, but what they had chosen to ignore. Marcus turned without a word and made his way down the aisle. The congregation parted instinctively, like the sea before a man carrying something too sacred to touch. As he stepped into the sunlight, the warmth hitting his face like a benediction, a strange, quiet peace settled over him. The fight was over. The greatest justice wasn't in shouting them down or in forcing their contrition. It was in knowing, and making them know, that love, real and fearless, had existed in spite of them, and that in the end, love had outlived their hate, forever.